As atheists and skeptics, we've all heard the argument that you can't prove a negative. It's a pretty common argument that's spread amongst us. The problem is, it's a myth. In this video, we'll take a look at this claim and look at whether logic does actually claim this. So, the last few days have been something of an adventure for me. And by adventure, I mean shit show. I got caught up in arguments with a few other atheists, with those arguments being about various things, including the burden of proof and the idea that you can't prove a negative, which, as you can probably guess, is what has inspired this video. In this video, I'll be focusing on the idea that you can't prove a negative. I do have a half-written script on the burden of proof, which I'll go back to after this, but for this video it will be the idea that you can't prove a negative that I'll focus on. Why focus on this, you might ask? Well, because the idea is so widespread among atheists and skeptics, with many cockily stating that others should take logic classes because you can't prove a negative is Logic 101. Which does little except to show that those making these statements haven't actually taken an introductory logic class. As there is no law of logic that states you cannot prove a negative, negatives are proven all the time. Even science proves negatives. This is something that was brought up in the discussion that prompted this video. However, the skeptics and atheists simply rejected all the arguments presented with a "nuh-uh, that doesn't prove a negative." Then when asked to provide what they thought proving a negative would look like, they responded with, well, the burden of proof is on you to show that you can prove a negative, not on me to show that they aren't proving a negative. Eventually ending with them blocking and muting me when I asked them to show me the law of logic that states this, or show me a logic text that shows this, or even a logician that argues this. This is why I think it's important to create a video like this, to dispel the popular myths spread by atheists and skeptics, as well as challenge what is considered unquestionable dogma by many atheists and skeptics. It's so unquestionable that many will mock you, insult you, yell at you, irrationally deny, and eventually block you over. Unquestionable dogma, especially unquestionable dogma based on myth, is what we as skeptics are supposed to be challenging, even when it's unquestionable dogma based on myths spread by skeptics and atheists. In fact, even more so when that's the case. Let's begin with a pretty obvious one. As stated by Stephen Law in his 2011 article, You Can Prove a Negative for Psychology Today, it is itself a negative claim. What is being said is that it is not possible to prove certain claims, making it a negative claim. Which means that, at least according to this statement, you cannot prove the statement itself. It cannot be proven that you cannot prove a negative. Yet the claim is held up as if it is some kind of unquestionable truth. Another thing to note here is that most positive claims can themselves be turned into a negative claim. Consider the following claim. I am currently lying on the floor typing this script on my laptop. That is a positive claim. Now consider the following claim. I am not currently lying on the floor typing this script on my laptop. The meaning of both of those claims is exactly the same. The only difference is that one is framed in a positive sense and one is framed in a negative sense. Here are a few more pairs. There is cheese in my fridge. There is no cheese in my fridge. I own an Acer laptop. I do not own an Acer laptop. There is an Alexa on my TV stand. There is no Alexa on my TV stand. All of those pairs say the same thing. It's just that one is framed positively and one is framed negatively. The negatively framed one does not suddenly become unprovable simply because it is framed in a negative sense. Negative claims are not, and definitely should not be, the iron chariots of the skeptic and atheist community. Let's take a look at one of those aforementioned claims. There is no cheese in my fridge. This one seems pretty obvious, doesn't it? All you really have to do with this one is open the fridge and look through it. The absence of any cheese in the fridge proves the negative claim that there is no cheese in the fridge. This gives an example of a case of proving a negative. If the cheese existed in the fridge, then we would expect to find some evidence of it. Of course, The skeptic here could argue something like, well, what if it's in a compartment that's hidden in the fridge that you don't know about? As happened during the discussion that prompted this video, though the example in that case was butter in the fridge rather than cheese. However, this is kind of a terrible rebuttal to the argument that there is no cheese in the fridge. Consider the idea of a secret compartment with cheese in it in your fridge. What are the chances that there is such a secret compartment in your fridge? If you have owned the fridge long enough, it seems unlikely that there is a compartment in your fridge that you have overlooked. Another thing to take into account is the likelihood of the manufacturer of your fridge putting a secret compartment in there. This is not something that fridge manufacturers are particularly prone to doing. It would raise the cost of manufacturing the fridge, therefore raise the cost of the price of the fridge and reduce sales, and it would be a completely useless accessory. So unless Loki is in charge of the manufacturing plant, it seems that all the evidence points towards it not being there. Plus, there would also be the added cost of purchasing the cheese, storing the cheese, and putting the cheese in the compartment before it is packaged and ready to be shipped off. All of these things seem to point towards the idea that the cheese in a secret compartment in our fridge does not exist. And therefore, the lack of cheese in our fridge is pretty good evidence that there is no cheese in the fridge. Of course, we could always completely dismantle the fridge in order to see if said secret compartment with this secret cheese exists. It seems more likely, though, that we can just forego that step and just admit that there is no cheese in our fridge. Even the skeptics that attempt this form of skepticism would not go to those lengths when they open the fridge door and see no cheese. They'll simply buy more cheese after thinking, there's no cheese in the fridge. There are other skeptical claims that could be made about the lack of cheese in the fridge, of course. However, they all point to one idea. That idea being that we need Cartesian certainty in order to be justified in stating that something doesn't exist. This idea was exemplified in one of the claims during the discussion that prompted this video. In that discussion, one of the interlocutors claimed that in order to be able to say that there's no cheese in the fridge, or butter in the case of that particular discussion, we would need to be omniscient. According to them, we would need all the knowledge in the universe before we could safely say that there being no visible cheese in the fridge proved that there is no cheese in the fridge. This portrays the idea that those looking for proof of the negative are looking for absolute 100% unquestionable certainty. Something negative has not been proven unless it is absolutely undoubtable. They are looking for what is known as Cartesian certainty, as stated. However, when it comes to many claims, both positive and negative, we do not have 100% certainty. Doubt can be cast on almost any claim. For those familiar with Descartes' skeptical argument, the only thing that he concluded that could be known with this kind of certainty is that our mind exists. And while Descartes believed his claim, philosophers through the ages have shown that this claim too can have doubts cast upon it. As I said, pretty much every claim can be cast into doubt. Standing to cross a road and see no cars coming down it? Well, how do you know that the sun isn't shining in your eyes in just the right way so as to obscure them, even if it doesn't feel like it? See the butter in the fridge? Well, how do you know that butter pixies didn't come into the fridge in the middle of the night and replace it with something that looks just like butter? These might sound like ridiculous ideas, but think back to the butter in the hidden compartment put there by the manufacturer. Doubts like these are little different when it comes to being ridiculous. Much of what we do and accept isn't done based on 100% certainty. And those same skeptics that reject claims of non-existence because they aren't 100% certain are more than happy to accept claims of existence that do not have 100% certainty. Even just other claims in general that aren't 100% certain. When we start our car in the morning, we can never be 100% certain that it will start. Yet we still believe it will start when we try. Unless we have prior experience of it taking 2 or 3 tries, of course. We generally expect to wake up in the morning after going to sleep, but we can never be 100% certain of that either. We accept and believe these things not based on 100% certainty, but based on reasonable inference and reasonable evidence. We are often justified in believing things, including positive existential and negative existential claims, based on reasonable inference and reasonable evidence. Few of our court verdicts are based on 100% certainty. Our belief that our spouse loves us is not based on 100% certainty. And even many scientific claims are not based on 100% certainty. Yet, few of those same skeptics are demanding 100% certainty in these cases. So why is the same not applied for non-existential claims? So why are those same ridiculous kind of skeptical claims not applied to something like science? Proving something rarely means proving something with 100% certainty. That belongs to the realm of maths, not to the realm of everyday experiences. Perhaps one of the problems is that the idea that you can't prove a negative is claimed as an actual law of logic or part of logic itself. This makes the claim attractive to many skeptics who want to live their lives based on logic and reason. This and other reasons make many skeptics accept this without question as it feels right, and the claim being widespread makes them feel as if they are safe to accept it unquestioned. There is a problem with that though. There simply is no law of logic that states you cannot prove a negative, nor is there any argument within logic itself that states you cannot prove a negative. When it comes to classical logic, the three laws are the law of identity, or A equals A, the law of non-contradiction, or A does not equal not A, the law of excluded middle, either A or not A. That's it. That is the three basic laws of logic. As we can see, there is no law there that states you cannot prove a negative. If someone was to take an introductory logic course, those are the three laws they will learn. And there will be nothing on not being able to prove a negative. And there is a reason for this. What's that reason? Well, negatives are proven all the time in logic. In fact, what we will look at next is based on the idea that logic can prove a negative. While not being able to prove a negative is not something you will learn in logic, you will learn about the argument form Modus Tollens. Modus Tollens is an argument form known as denying the consequent. It's a deductive argument of the form premise 1, P therefore Q, premise 2, not Q, conclusion, therefore not P. Or to put it in slightly more English language, it is of the form if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P. If we plug in something slightly less symbolic, the idea behind it becomes a little clearer. Premise 1. If there is a world-destroying black hole in the Earth's atmosphere, then the Earth would be destroyed, if P then Q. Premise 2. The Earth is not destroyed, not Q. Conclusion. Therefore, there is no world-destroying black hole in the Earth's atmosphere. Therefore not P. The inferences follow in such a way that the original claim can be, and is, discarded. This form of argument is valid and sound. We can know it is sound because if Q in this case was true, then you wouldn't be here watching this video, as the world would have been destroyed. But you are here, so this is pretty good evidence that the world hasn't been destroyed. In other words, this argument and the evidence for it has proven a negative. It has proven that there is no Earth-destroying black hole in the Earth's atmosphere. In logic, this form of argument is often used to prove negatives. One of the purposes of the Modus Tollens is to deny a positive claim, and to show that positive claim to be false. Let's look at another example. If the Earth is flat, then the Earth is not an oblate spheroid. If P then Q. The Earth is an oblate spheroid, not Q. Therefore, the Earth is not flat. Therefore not P. This argument proves the negative claim, the Earth is not flat. When we add all of the other evidence that goes into showing that the Earth is an oblate spheroid, we can see that it is a sound argument as well as a valid argument. The evidence and the argument prove the negative claim, the Earth is not flat. The previous example also gives us another example of how we can prove a negative. In the example of the flat Earth and the oblate spheroid Earth, we are presented with two different shapes of the Earth. Both of these options are mutually exclusive. If one is true, then the other cannot be true. The Earth cannot be both flat and an oblate spheroid at the same time. It must be one or the other. So if the claim the Earth is an oblate spheroid is true, then the negative claim the Earth is not flat is true. The same can be said in reverse also. If the claim the Earth is flat is true, then the negative claim the Earth is not an oblate spheroid is true. The proving of one disproves the other. If two claims contradict each other, then the truth is mutually exclusive for each claim. If one is proven, then all other contradictory claims are proven to be false, thus proving that each and every contradictory claim is false. Now, one might argue here that these are positive claims proven false, rather than negative claims proven true. But thinking back to earlier in the video, it was mentioned that all positive claims can be put linguistically in a negative claim. And something similar can be said here. If we think of the claim the Earth is flat, that expresses the proposition as if it is true. But simply rephrasing it as the Earth is not flat is simply expressing the proposition as if it is false, with that negative form of the proposition being true. By proving the Earth is an oblate spheroid, the negative form of the Earth is flat is made true. In other words, the negative claim is shown to be true, meaning that logic, reason, and physical evidence have proven the negative claim. So not only can deduction be used to prove a negative, so can mutually exclusive claims. When one positive mutually exclusive claim is proven true, the negative forms of the other mutually exclusive claims are also proven true. The fact that the positive claim is proven false proves the negative claim to be true. Another way that we can show that something does not exist is through the absence of evidence. Now, I know many will want to say here, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and you know what? I kind of agree. Well, I agree if you insert the word necessarily in between the words not and evidence. Absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence. However, there are times when absence of evidence is evidence of absence. There are times when we should expect to see particular evidence if some claim is true. And if that evidence is not there, then the claim cannot be true. Imagine if I said to you, I have 3 coins in my hand, and then hold my hand out and my palm is empty. If my claim were true, we would expect to see 3 coins in my hand. The 3 coins would be the evidence that I have 3 coins in my hand. The absence of any coins in my hands is an absence of evidence for that claim. Therefore, in this case, the absence of evidence is evidence of absence. And there are plenty of examples of this. One I already brought up was the cheese in the fridge. If there was cheese in the fridge, then we would expect to see cheese in the fridge. If there's no cheese in the fridge, then the absence of cheese is evidence for the claim there is no cheese in the fridge. This is not to say that the absence of evidence is always evidence of absence, hence my inclusion of necessarily in the statement. There are plenty of times where the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It's only in the case of examples where we would expect to see very specific evidence. Think back to the brief discussion on Modus Tollens style arguments, and this should give you some insight into the idea. As we can see then, there definitely are ways that we can prove a negative. There are both inductive and deductive ways to prove a negative. However, many of these examples were used during the discussion that prompted this video. So for the remainder of the video, let's run through a few of them and look at why they don't apply, or don't actually counter the arguments being made. We've already looked at one of them, the hidden compartment in the fridge rebuttal. As we've already discussed that one, then we'll leave that one alone. Skip back to earlier in the video if you want to go over it again. Let's begin with some of the other rebuttals I got, and also slip in a new way to prove a negative at the same time. One claim that many make about not being able to prove a negative is that it's not about all negative claims. It's about negative claims about existence. It's impossible to prove that something doesn't exist. We saw a couple of examples earlier about how to prove something doesn't exist. There was the example of the world-destroying black hole in the Earth's atmosphere and the existence of the flat Earth. There were a few different rebuttals to these, but let's focus on one that's pretty common. Often when presented with the localized proof, the interlocutor might respond with, "You can't prove universal non-existence." However, there's an example for that, and a very simple one. We have the square circle. A square is defined in the Cambridge Online Dictionary as a flat shape with 4 sides of equal length and 4 angles of 90 degrees. And a circle is defined in the Cambridge Online Dictionary as a continuous curved line, the points of which are always the distance away from a fixed central point or the area inside such a line. As can clearly be seen, the two definitions are so different from each other that one shape could never be the other shape. The way these objects are defined means that they are incompatible with each other, making it impossible for a square circle to exist anywhere at any time. There are plenty of such examples that can be found, such as an invisible pink unicorn, a cube that is black all over and white all over, a human that is infinitely tall, and many others. These examples may seem ridiculous, of course, but are they any more ridiculous than arguing for a secret compartment containing butter put in the fridge by the manufacturer? To me, it seems not. When presented with the square circle, one of my interlocutors argued that this was just showing two definitions incompatible with each other and not showing a universal negative. However, think about some of the arguments made for not believing in God. There are many that rely on such incompatible definitions, like a perfectly loving being would not torture something for eternity. These are expressions of the same idea of incompatible properties. If something contains incompatible properties, then it is logically impossible, making it impossible to exist in a universal sense. There were a couple of responses I've received to the flat earth example as well. One of them was that there could exist out there in the infinite universe a world that mirrors our own, whose population called the planet Earth that is in fact flat. This objection sounds like a reasonable defeater for the non-existence of the flat earth at first glance, doesn't it? The problem is that it really isn't. The reason for this is that if you are talking about something other than our Earth, you are no longer talking about the argument being made. The argument about the existence of the flat Earth is speaking very specifically about our Earth. Our Earth is the propositional content in the argument. Each time the word Earth is used, it refers to our Earth. By replacing that propositional content with the propositional content referring to another planet, an equivocation fallacy is being created. So this does not defeat the argument, it instead changes the argument. The same response was given to the argument about the Earth-destroying black hole. When presented with this argument, my interlocutor replied with, just because it doesn't exist here, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist elsewhere. However, this too fails to defeat the argument for the very same reason talking about a different world in the flat Earth argument does. The black hole argument very specifically talks about a black hole in the Earth's atmosphere. If the argument is then made that it could exist elsewhere, then a different argument is being spoken about. The propositional content has changed, and therefore the argument has changed. Another response to the flat Earth argument was that the argument was about shape, not existence. And yes, I agree, it could be argued that it is to some degree. However, it is also about existence. As mentioned earlier in the video, the two shapes of the Earth are mutually exclusive. They are contradictory. If it is one shape, it is not the other. However, if the Earth exists as one shape, then it does not exist as the other. Meaning that the statement, the flat Earth does not exist, becomes a true claim if the Earth is an oblate spheroid. One thing to note here is that even if we discount existence, it would still be an example that you can prove a negative. It proves that the Earth is not flat. There are several more examples that could be brought up here, but the video runtime is obviously getting a little long. And the reasons these examples don't work can be transferred to other examples of rebuttals with similarities. Something important to focus on here before we get to the end of the video, though, is the idea of falsifiability. Falsifiability is something that any fan of science and any good skeptic should be familiar with. If a proposition is falsifiable, there is a way to get a true or false answer for that proposition. In fact, the idea of falsification works on the ability to prove a hypothesis false. A hypothesis is created, and then those working on it attempt to prove it false. They attempt to prove the corresponding negative claim of the hypothesis. Those that survive falsification and survive testing continue to be worked on. By arguing that you cannot prove a negative, one is essentially arguing that science cannot be done. Something I'm sure that no atheist or skeptic wants to argue. Which brings us to a time when you cannot prove a negative, when an idea or a hypothesis is not falsifiable. However, while we may not be able to falsify certain ideas or hypotheses, this does not mean that we cannot have reasonable justifications for believing it to be false, so long as the argument is reasonable and rational and raises the probability of it not being true to enough of an extent that we can rationally believe it false. We can prove it in that sense, as mentioned earlier on in the video. I think one of the things behind the prevalence of this idea that you can't prove a negative comes, at least in part, from the theists. Many theists will argue something like, prove God doesn't exist, or you can't prove God doesn't exist, as well as the faulty idea that you can't prove a negative is something dictated by logic itself, of course. It then becomes a knee-jerk reaction to the arguments made by theists, similar to the burden of proof is on the theist argument. It becomes an easy counter for the atheist. However, the ideas that you cannot prove a negative, or that you can't prove something doesn't exist, and that kind of thing, have become unquestionable dogmas. When challenged about it, many skeptics and atheists that hold to this idea become pretty damn angry. Or, as we've seen from some of the examples in this video, will try to make as many ridiculous rebuttals to the idea as possible. Then, when those rebuttals continue to fail, they will eventually block you or mute you when you argue its falsity. Which is another one of the reasons that I'm making this video, to try to push back against that dogma. Dogma like that has no place in atheism or skepticism. One of the things that many atheists and skeptics will claim is that they like to be shown when they're wrong, as it means they've learned something new, as well as the idea that they want to believe as many true things as possible and as few false things as possible. Yet, this is a true thing that many refuse to believe or refuse to correct. Not only do many skeptics and atheists refuse to believe it, but they will also block and mute people that question it, leading to the creation of echo chambers that protect said dogma. Another thing that is antithetical to good skepticism. Something that they should remember is that admitting that we can actually prove a negative does not give any ground to the theist. Just because we can prove some negatives, it does not mean that we can prove all negatives. There are very clearly some negatives that we cannot prove. At least not in the sense of Cartesian certainty, as mentioned earlier on in the video. However, it should also be remembered that just because we cannot prove something with Cartesian certainty, that does not mean that we cannot prove that thing. We can have very reasonable and very rational justifications for believing something to be true or false based on logic, reason, evidence, and other such things, which perhaps is the best we can hope for in a lot of cases when it comes to existence and non-existence. The same thing can be said for the existence of God. There are a lot of arguments out there, especially in the philosophy of religion, that attempt to do this very thing. Check out channels like Real Atheology, Emerson Green, Counter-Apologist, The Non-Alchemist, and other such channels. There are plenty of very good arguments available on their channels, if you're not looking for Cartesian certainty at least. And if you are looking for Cartesian certainty, ask yourself why. And ask yourself if you expect Cartesian certainty from everything, including science. If you ask it of science, then you are misunderstanding science, and you should be just as skeptical of science as you are that there is a secret compartment containing cheese put there by the manufacturer. Anyway, I apologize once again for the video being such a long one. I really am trying to get into the habit of creating much shorter ones, I promise. But sometimes a topic is larger than a short video allows, especially if you're trying to cover a lot of bases. Hopefully it will at least have been interesting. And hopefully if you're one of those that argues that you can't prove a negative, this video may help you to reconsider that claim, as well as reconsider some of the rebuttals you might make to the idea. If you are making the argument that logic dictates that you cannot prove a negative, feel free to drop me a comment and I can recommend some books on logic if you're interested. For now, though, see you next time. I hope life treats you well. Take care.